Hello everyone, today we talk about the Kingdom of Asturias, the Asturum Regnum in Latin, the Reino d'Asturias in Asturian, lasting from 718 to 924, founded in the north of the Iberian Peninsula by the Visigothic nobleman Pelagius. We will talk more about him because the historical character is infinitely debated historiographically. We know actually very few about him. There are lots of legends, most of them arguably spurious, etc. But I think I've never made a video about this kind of time and place of switching from Visigothic to Islamic power plus this northern frontier being invested, but by the Islamic invasion, but fundamentally resisting fiercely against, especially at the very beginning. We will see how the thing unfolded politically. There were times, of course, of not much just of peace with the Andalusians, but of actual just say relative isolation, or at least of calm, right? That brought this power mostly to fight actually internally, right, because of the political mechanisms, that new ones that were taking place. In any case, the Kingdom of Asturias was the first Christian political entity to be established after the Umayyad conquest of the Visigothic kingdom, right, and of Hispania specifically, in 780. That year, Pelagius defeated, there is a debate regarding the date as well, either the same 718 or 722. However, at the Battle of Covadonga, the Umayyad army, right, which is quite of a symbolic beginning of the Reconquista, opening in the following centuries again the path of the south to at least Christian domination. Again, I will try to make it simple on the basis of my usual very short introductions, kind of historical region series. But again, I will come back on this stuff powerfully in depth, because it really deserves, and it's also a relatively mysterious phase of Iberian affairs. In any case, we will focus on the political side, like just the Asturian. I hate the term perspective, but there is more, say, also in terms of religious history, the adoptionism, lots of, say, of troubles, especially that had to do, in fact, with the Gothic times, and what had happened, especially with the councils of Toledo, the competition with Rome. Later on, essentially, the Visigothic right would be substituted by the Roman one in exchange for papal support to the Christian north of the peninsula. There is a very important cultural exchange in that regard. For example, there were some refugees, right, from Spain to Italy at some point. There was naturally an interesting intertwinement between the Asturias and we'll see it now, Galicia, the Basque countries, and eventually with the Carolingians. I made a video about the Duchy of Gascony that tells you a bit how these northern Iberians acted as proxies for the clashes, mostly supporting the Franks, but at sometimes also taking arms against them, famously enough, together with the Muslims, even at the Frankish route of Roncesvalles, after which the famous Chanson de Roland, etc. In any case, let's start from Pelagius, Pelayo, or Don Pelayo in Spanish. That is, in fact, the central heroic Christian noble figure around which the, say, ideally, at least the remnants of the Visigothic kingdom gather to continue their fight against the Muslims, right? So the idea that the kingdom was properly established by this figure is naturally not entirely correct. We do not know exactly who Pelagius really was. He may have been actually an Asturian noble, and don't think that these people liked the Visigoths at all, right? Because the north of the Iberian Peninsula had always remained notoriously very, very much on its own. It was a primitive area separated, in fact, in this case, by the Asturian mountains from the Spanish Meseta. That had been resisting, as you know, to the Romans back in the day, to the Visigoths, right? It had a very strong Celtic, at least cultural, ancestral substratum, or better, it was, just the substratum was Iberian, but being heavily influenced by, Celtic culture. And at some point, the peoples around, the Cantabrians as well, appearing as de facto not even Celtic-Iberian, but somewhat Celtic peoples. There were contacts with surely the Celtic French in the north, Brittany, Ireland, Cornwall, Wales, all these places, notoriously from a long time before. There are also certain types of the so-called castros that are very similar in engineering, in architecture, to the to the Pictish forts, right, of the 6th, the 7th century, this kind of things. And surely there is also a maritime dimension that actually will not be invested in particularly, because Iberian powers will remain fundamentally continental. They would always fundamentally receive, if anything, the support of other maritime powers, and in this case being actually attacked by the Vikings during these centuries. But for the latter, right, this was no fun, right? Because actually the Asturians managed to crash the Norse invasions, so with an interesting bloody consequence. So, say no substantial movement of refugees from central Iberia could have been taken in this place, right? Say the area could not sustain literally massive amounts of crowds of people, right? So I understand it's seducing to think that the Asturias collected, in a sense, the Visigothic legacy, but that's been mostly like the effort to make this a sort of unitary recollection around, say, a sort of, in fact, still previous Iberian world now confined to the north. The truth is that the true Iberian world at large remained in the south under the Muslims, and largely continuing, in fact, what had been before at the same time. Surely there were some groups, say the same Visigothic kingdom, and this continues during the Reconquista, as far as any power that ruled the Meseta especially was concerned about. Very composite, right? The northern marches that were established exactly to counter peoples like the Asturians, the Cantabrians, the Basques, and so on, were substantially detached from, not just from Toledo, but from the south, for example, that had been maintaining a very strong Roman outlook. Recently made a video also about medieval Catalonia, so the Ebro Valley, but more the northeastern Mediterranean dimension was strongly Roman as well, and Gothic at the same time. So the Iberian Peninsula is huge, right? Portugal and Spain make more than France extensively, and it's an even more diversified, say, climatic, just properly territorial area, right? And cultures were also that kind of shaded across the entire peninsula. So what we have at the Battle of Covadonga that we will talk about now is mostly the rebellion to Islamic Berber establishment, a garrisoning of the local area that at some point was overrun, right? The Muslims nominally managed to, at some point, to subjugate the entirety of the peninsula. I also made a video about this because there was all a universal ideology attached to the, say, the Islamic version of the empire, in a sense to this. But naturally, these northern ones were the most difficult areas to control and the more subject to rebellion, also objectively the least appealing, but the ones from which, exactly because of this kind of more sheltered dimension, would harbor the most kind of warlike resistance against the Muslims, and the Reconquista would in fact start. And it's fair to say that really the Battle of Covadonga can at least embody that kind of beginning, right, of the Reconquista itself as a multi-century phenomenon. In 714, Asturias had been overrun by the Yemeni Emir Musa bin Nusair. We are not informed of any form of resistance taking place in the Asturias at that point. At least it would be obvious not to be recorded. Surely there was some attempt of defense, but this was evidently not effective, nor for a while, like any other resistance was able to dislodge the local Muslims. There is a series of theories, at least of hypotheses, about Pelagius' role in all this. Some say that he would have essentially retired to the Asturian mountains after having participated to the Battle of Guadalete. So the one in which the Umayyads crashed the Visigothic kingdom with the death of, in fact, the ruler Roderick, and so the major, let's say, the clash, right, between the Muslims and the Visigothic forces, really profiling the ultimate end. So he would have been part of the, say, of the cool battle. So this was the hero escaping from that and restarting from there. We do not really know, right? We have another tradition, the Gothic one of Theias specifically. Pelagius being elected by other noblemen as the leader of the Asturias. Pelagius' kingdom was initially, this is as much as we know, a rallying banner for existing guerrilla forces, right? The Asturias didn't have much else, much of an option, right? They had lots of mountains, pastures, tribes, let's say villages, scattered all over the territory. There was no real center, right, in the guise of a city proper. Oviedo will rise, as we will see, gradually, just because of during the consolidation of the kingdom. But it was a very difficult territory to occupy and to maintain, to garrison at least, and so resistance could resume from the mountains down the valleys, showing, though, that at that point the Muslims had been strong. This was in fact happening during the same fall. Basically all the major cities and other administrative centers, fortresses, etc. of the Iberian Peninsula in the hands of the Islamic forces, right? The control of the central and southern regions, such as the Guadalquivir and Ebro valleys, presented relatively few problems for the newcomers. So there was resistance there as well. We've seen also in the video about medieval Catalonia how complicated it was, again, from Cordoba to control the northeast of Spain. It was not less difficult for the Visigoths before. That's the point. The idea of at least of a central Iberian, in this case, the main power was already in part shifting towards the south. Now we don't have already, before the Islamic conquest, but this is for another video. But in general, the concept of having at least an officially recognized central power, namely the councils of Toledo, that were the expression of the nobility, say, of the clergy, as sponsored by the nobility, actually against the king, but still, right, capable of requiring tribute, right, of levying resources from the periphery. So a periphery that would mostly rebel. Well, this is all stuff that the Muslims, aside from the religious point of view, inherited from the Visigoths. The south of the peninsula was by far the most advanced, right? The single most Romanized, the richest, the most fertile, the most developed. In many ways, it's obviously the Arabs installed themselves there as the greatest center of power, capable of supporting, again, essentially a state, a bureaucracy, a permanent army, and we will see it in another video. But even from there, controlling the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula was quite complicated, right? The main, town at this point in Asturias was Gijón. I think it's pronounced Gijón. I think was basically the only main concentration, right, in Asturias, and it that for the rest remained, again, a country that had to be subjugated by taming ballet after ballet, rather than just holding a center per se, because this was just, in relative terms, not enough to control these other places. Islamic forces often resorted to the taking of hostages, right, to ensure the pacification of the newly conquered territory. It was an habitual practice. I tame you. I have to get out of here anyway. So just to keep you obedient, I will take some members of your clan as hostage, and if you don't pay, something negative is gonna happen to them, or I will use them as political pawns for achieving this control. The first Islamic incursion in the Iberian Peninsula had been under Tariq ibn Ziyad, right, who had reached Toledo in 711. So it's the aforementioned Musa bin Nusair that was this, again, Yemeni commander entrusted with the rule of Ifriqiya, basically of Tunisia, and parts of the Libyan coast, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in turn in 712, and carried out this massive operation of conquest that brought under Islamic control all the various cities, again, in the center, in the northeast, Merida, Toledo, Zaragoza, Lerida, among the others. This way was really impressive, right? During the last phase of his military campaign, Musa pushed into the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula, and that's when Lugo in Galicia and Gijón in the Asturias were taken over. In the latter, Musa placed a small African detachment under a governor, Munuza ibn Naisa, whose mission was to consolidate the Islamic control over the province, right? So a normal campaign of conquest and of permanent occupation. And as a guarantee of the submission of the Asturias, some nobles, and the legend says that Pelagius was among them, had to provide hostages from the Asturias to these rulers, and ultimately to Cordoba, because that's where they would have been sent, right, to the Islamic capital in Iberia. So again, all this pack of legends about Pelagius. One says that his sister was asked for hostage, and specifically a marriage alliance being sought with the local Berber commander, right? In fact, eventually Munuza would try to do the same at another mountain post in the Pyrenees that he rebelled from himself against his Cordoban rulers, let's say, which tells you again the most common thing in this, either whoever was ruling from the south, the autonomization, right, of this frontier districts, and also the alliance, in fact, as we just observed, with the local nobility. Consider in all this that there was a divide, in fact, within the same Muslims concerning those who had been just converted, right, such as the Berbers, that were historically either pagan or best Christians, and that were considered for this reason kind of lesser people to the ethnic Arabs or to the Syrians that were at least more quoted in a way. The Arabs had been the conquering people, mostly the elites were Arabized in some ways, the same Syrians that were quite advanced, right, just because those were fundamentally Roman areas. And there would have been, especially among the filing rank trooper, mostly recruited from North Africa in this case, that's where mostly the army that conquered Spain came from, a sort of bitterness against such elite. But it wasn't just about this, right? It was also about the chance of political autonomization that could be offered by simply the position and the circumstances. Now, the most commonly accepted hypothesis for the Battle of Covadonga is, as it's described at least only later by the Christian sources, right, and even in the Islamic ones actually appearing like merely a skirmish, is that the Muslim army was basically ambushed, being attacked from the cliffs and pushed down the valleys towards basically what is today's Hijon, to finally be crushed by the Christians. However, the only near contemporary account of the events of the time, that is the Christian Chronicle of 754, does not talk about the Battle of Covadonga. The fact, the first major source talking about this clash is the Hortensian Chronicle, the one of Alfonso III. We're in the 10th century, right? Over which, in fact, also later historiography, including the modern Islamic one, for example, the one of the work of Ahmed Muhammad al-Makari, an Algerian scholar living between the 6th and the 17th century, drew from. And naturally, it's a suspicious source in theory, right? I don't want to digress on whether it's reliable or not, because it definitely tells things in suspicious detail, or at least in a way that could have easily been fabricated, right? At least as far as the narrative goes. And that tells essentially the history of Pelagius escaping from Cordoba, where he had been a hostage, according to the source we were hinting at before. This at the time, in fact, it was the same year, 717, 718, when al-Hurr was ruling the Umayyad province of Al-Andalus, and at Pelagius' return to the Asturias, he triggered a revolt against the Islamic forces garrisoning Hiyong. We are very, say, uncertain about the character of Pelagius per se. Naturally, you need a leader, and this historical figure, which we think he really was, naturally had to be loaded with some greater symbolic value, right? And becoming the protagonist of all these. Now, none of this information is, say, unlikely per se, right? But we just don't have the account from the same time, which again, compared to most, especially for how, say, the early Middle Ages basically work, right? That's especially also in other parts of Europe, parts in the same Iberian Peninsula, is quite like an alarm ringing, saying, "Watch out," because we do not know exactly whether this thing is even embellished later. Was a thing. In any case, the idea is that Pelagius was living at that point in Brest, that is in the district of today's Pilonia, right, in the Asturias, and at that point Munuza sent his troops there under Al-Kam, another command. So, having received news of the arrival of these garrison locally, Pelagius and his retinue hurriedly crossed the Pilonia River and headed towards a narrow, easily defensible valley of the Mount Auseva, taking refuge allegedly in one of its caves, right? In fact, the Covadonga, from which they began to harass the Islamic garrison, which was operating in the territory to put down this revolt, right? Essentially chasing these troops, being very careful not to fall into ambushes. There was an attempted siege, abandoned due to the weather that those areas up in the mountains, especially, is not really pleasant. Eventually passing through the aforementioned Deep Valley Gorge in search of other rebels, right, to take them out. And that's where Pelagius and his forces would have essentially met with the with the Islamic enemies, who were annihilated in the ambush. There were some, admittedly few, survivors that managed to escape, heading south towards the plains of Leon that were occupied at the time by the Muslims. You know that Leon would be eventually, say, brought together. This was actually conquered by the kings of Asturias, and later would be attached to Castilla as well. So that these are all the lands from which originally most of the Reconquista push would have started from. And this battle allowed fundamentally the Asturians to recover much of their local autonomy, if not independence, because the maritime districts of Asturias towards the Atlantic were now cleared of Islamic presence. Like you can imagine, other avantposts being taken out after this greater force was taken out. So, giving a substantial room for maneuver by Pelagius that naturally was very, very appreciated, right? Very praised and rewarded for this. We again are talking about a legion, right? As far as we understand, actually only a small quantity of Berber forces were essentially crushed in this ambush that might have seemed really a little thing in the bigger game of the Mayas in Spain. But for the Asturians was nevertheless quite empowering, as we were just saying, and it objectively began, if it ever happened at all. But this is, I presume, sure, because in any case the Asturians recovered their own autonomy in these years, so there must have been some clash of sort, but otherwise it would have been difficult for the Islamic forces to simply bail out without any reason, right? More than this victory was so inspiring that Galicia rebelled together with Asturias, contributing to thicken the ranks of Pelagius' forces, right? Electing him allegedly either Rex or Dux, depending on which kind of, again, here we don't know exactly, but these were, Rex is a big word. Dux makes like it more sound like a Gothic military title of some sort, but again, most of these people spoke Romance, even they had been Celtic at some point, and the idea of being mostly a military commander of the area, frontier area, like fits with this general denomination. So after this success, the Asturians under Pelagius increased the attacks on the Muslims. At that point, Munuza, that felt isolated in this increasingly hostile region, decided to abandon Hillon, heading for the Meseta plateau through the Mesa Trail, where apparently he was intercepted and killed by the Asturians at Olalius. They would be close to the municipality of Grado, right? This would have accounted for another major success, naturally, of now a people that had resumed full control of its own territory. At this point, Pelagius decided to attack Muslim Leon. Leon was just the broader region, but taking the name from the city, right? That basically was the largest in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula, so represented a bit like even there the heart of the Islamic domination on the entire region. All this was done by securing the mountain passes, preventing the Muslims to essentially attack the Asturians back. Right, this was a major strategic concern, because you understand that, again, it's mostly, again, the Asturias a mountainous area. Mostly, you do not want to enter there just if you know that there is an active military resistance, and especially if you don't have enough forces and the enemy controls the passes. Pelagius decides instead to again move his mountaineers against the lowlands that are naturally richer in cattle, in agricultural supplies, and so on. There was some important clash, right? Any avampost from the Asturian mountains was cleared by the Muslims. This had happened mostly because of desertion than even Asturian pressure, right? Again, these were mostly foreigners brought God knows from where, even North Africa, and they didn't want to die simply, in this far north without any connection even with the locals first of all, but not even much familiarity with their own Islamic leaders. So this rebellion, as you understand, extended as a notable one against the Arab control directed from Cordoba. Right at this point, Pelagius marries Ermesinda, that was his daughter to Alfonso, the son of Peter of Cantabria, who was basically ruling this land as just as a successor of the Visigothic dukes in the area. And this naturally was important again to join forces against the Muslims. Pelagius' son Fabula was instead married to Froluba, and we will see just because the Asturians eventually were ruled all by the house, or at least the biological, let's say, in female line. We'll see now descendants of Pelagius. That naturally, imagine, I don't know, Spain in the early 8th century, and especially with this, wave of religious threat clash that was informing, again, this very brutal, primitive lands of the north. So also in kind of this traditional warlike sense of, again, of martyrdom, of transcendence. So blood genetics were very important in all this, right? The Reconquista here, as I was saying before, it's not much a matter of Visigothic legacy, but really of Christian identity, right? This is what emerges also from the following century. They weren't calling themselves Visigoths, first of all, because they hadn't historically been, the majority of them who weren't. But secondly, because the clash was seen as really a total, again, it's David against Goliath in this context, right? It's really a baseland, and even perhaps not understood in that kind of unitary idea, but at least fighting against Islamic forces. At this point, the Umayyad ones were some of the most advanced of the time, especially at this point, after the Iberian conquest, right, for these northerners, that it does feel like you're fighting against the world entire, world that you have to reconquer, right? And all these ideas, just the lifestyle of the mountaineers, was bringing them to habitually carry out this raids as much as they had been doing, in fact, against the Visigoths in previous times. There are some archaeological finds uncovering fortifications dating from the end of the 7th, beginning of the 8th century in places like Mount Amon and La Carriza, near the Huerna and Payares valleys. These are attributed essentially to the Muslims, right? These were erected at the time of the Islamic conquest. They included watchtowers, almost 2 meters tall moats. So this entailed, by the way, the use of a substantial amount of labor force, especially from a quantitative point of view in relative terms from the locals, right? Hundreds of people that were just co-opted in these constructions, right, as subjects, surely, and that, generally speaking, show what this frontier was really about, right? The Muslims were aware of the risks, and we can see, however, that these fortifications at some point are maintained, are conquered and upkept by the same Asturians, and so by Pelagius, we think, right, that must have organized these fortifications further to consolidate a local dominion. So this entails a substantial political cohesion, support, again, because surplus there is not much, right? So if you manage to still maintain this infrastructure, right, means you have a substantial support. As we'll see, society will change significantly. But say the kingdom of Asturias was let's say, a novelty in a monarchic sense in the area. So still the concept of a unitary and somehow dynastic power was taking place also in the measure in which this clans could control on virtue of their primacy as such important fortifications. That switch basically from, say, defending the south from the north to actually defend the north from the south, right? And or to still, in fact, allow the northerners to launch raids in the south, right? It's a sort of buffer area to prevent the most interland passengers to be ravaged and all the stuff that would, in fact, occur even relatively late in time up to the 10th century or even the 11th in this region. In any case, after Pelagius' victory over the Muslims at Covadonga, in any case, it's at this point, in fact, that the kingdom of the Asturias, as a small but independent territorial entity, is established, right, by the local communities. This kingship naturally has nothing to do with any previous one having existed in Spain, right? The Visigothic one was founded on completely different basis. So again, it's wrong to stress that continuity. There is in a cultural sense, there is in a religious sense, but there is not in an ethnic and properly in a politically identitary sense, right? The first kings of Asturias, first of all, called themselves principes, right? So princes, only later reges, kings, and the title in itself was not firmly established, recognized, attributed until the period of Alphonse the Second. We will see him later. The sense of princeps is, of course, the one of a sort of first among equals for the local communities. The Galicians used that in the west. The Cantabrians used them as well. For example, there is in the district of Cogaña an inscription saying "Nicer Príncipe de los Albiones," right, and Princeps Cantabrorum, right. So the idea again is there are lots of different noblemen, and that one just stands out because he's conferred traditionally some sort of mostly military powers in a condition of emergency or whatever, right? This Princeps Cantabrorum is to be found in Cisterna over a gravestone. This is in Leon, by the way, and therefore from later times. So just again, there was a sort of a resistance feeling that brought this polity to emerge, right, to free themselves from the Umayyad diktat, right, not differently from how it had happened in Visigothic times, and also as far as pre-Roman times, they had been resisting to the imperial legions, etc. There was surely a Gothic influence to the Asturian kingdom, but again, not even recognized positively by the locals. Many Visigoths had to flee the south when the Arabs had arrived. They had not accepted to become subjects. In part, there was, of course, an elite, concentration, because these were the people who could travel the fastest in the first place. The local inhabitants were mostly destined to remain peasants. Actually, they had mostly been in Visigothic Spain. It was very similar to Gaul in this, right? The Roman latifundia had been resized but not cancelled, right? The majority of the people were just colonists. The north had been different. There had been a phenomenon of that kind, of course, from Roman times that had when, of course, those people had been ruled like that as well. But first of all, there were poorer areas, and after the collapse of kind of greater authority, it was practically impossible just to constrain the local communities in estates that did not exist, in fact, and that there was simply no authority to enforce, so they were mostly clanic concentrations and things like that. At the beginning of the 9th century, we find Alphonse II of Asturias cursing the Visigoths, just for telling you how the thing really was. They considered them cowards. Again, they were different peoples, and the idea is that it was the Visigoths' fault if Spain had fallen to the Arabs, which also makes sense. Again, those were the old enemies. They had been crushed by these, debatably worse ones. In any case, were still enemies, and so everybody was, at that point saying, I told you, those were bad guys, and they were crushed by these other bad guys, and so nobody likes either of the two, and we are not Visigothic. The Gothic influence, however, is to be found in a general cultural sense, especially at the time of Alphonse III. We will see later, we have 3 chronicles that just in narratives, in style, in general political concepts, have a pretty strong Gothic kind of formamentus, we could say. They of course, there was some kind of political institutional model there from the more advanced Gothic South, let's say, to collect as a political legacy. Right, we find this stuff mostly in the aforementioned chronicles, the Chronica Sebastianense, the Chronica Albeldense, and the Chronica Rotense. The latter is the first one about the Battle of Covadonga, excuse me. Very important, as you can imagine, in such a loosely held together territory, were marriage alliances. Pelagius' glory had determined quite an interesting set of relations, right, among the most powerful families of northern Iberia. Ermesinde, that it was Pelagius' daughter, as we've seen, was married to Alfonso, the son of the Dux Peter of Cantabria. Alfonso's son Fruela married Munian. It was a Basque princess from Alava. The Basques were, as we will see, not really friendly with the Asturians and the Cantabrians, right? But they also were fragmented at that point. Powerful rulers tried to stabilize internally with such foreign marriages. Alfonso's daughter, Adosinda, was married to Sila, that instead was a local chief from the area of Flavionavia in Pravia. So Pelagius died in 737. His son Fabila, or Fafila, depending on how you want to spell it, was elected, at least monarch, let's say, generically, of the Asturians. He, according to the chronicles, was, let's say, unexpectedly killed by a bear. Things that can happen randomly in, early 8th century Asturias. This had actually to do with a sort of initiatory trial, right? It was allegedly a hunting accident, but the idea is that, again, these chieftains are pretty interesting, people to psychiatrically analyze contemporary standards, given they had essentially to initiate, to be reborn, right, to be trained, and just being the sense, let's say, considered fit for command by slaughtering a powerful enemy slash animal, right, which could be literally the same thing, meaning that behind this, again, the idea of a bear or other figures, there may have been literally the idea that this was a chieftain of some sort, maybe in the guise of berserkers or this type of stuff, but at times would be an actual wild beast. And there is no, this is a bit of a myth, right? There is no actual account of other monarchs from this point being killed by a bear, right? But the way at least this is written in the legend, given the nature of the literary account, is very similarly sounding to the Roman legend of Romulus that is taken, as you know, in the apotheosis by a sudden storm. And so the idea is that this guy had kind of disappeared. In a way, it sounds also vaguely Shia, given the proximity of the Muslims that were, however, essentially Sunni there. So in any case, the immediate consequence of this departure was the rule of Favila's brother-in-law, as we've seen for the guy who had married his sister, and ruling from the neighboring dependent domain. But the female ties were quite important because the fact that this girl was Pelagius' she was Pelagius' daughter, actually. The thing would continue with the granddaughters and so on, is the fact that they were, again, in virtue of being his descendants, still bearing part of his legacy. And so also the title, in a way, was assumed by, say, taken control traditionally by their husbands. But it was traditional because women could not rule technically, if not on behalf of some sort of protector. This still shows a clanic outlook of the region, right? So something that is surely getting dynastic, especially at those levels, but that still counts on the idea of, whose group is this, rather than whose blood, in which kind of recognized kind of political stratification we were looking at, right? The latter sense of dynasty was also based on the one of let's stabilize, let's normalize on the base of this biological descendancy, because there is literally no other way to centralize. Otherwise, it's just more like a convention, mostly feudal times, right? That these really weren't, right? Especially in the north. Thus, Pelagius founded a dynasty in Asturias, under whom the kingdom's boundaries would be gradually extended, uniting basically all northwestern Iberia by the third quarter of the 8th century. It's under the reign of Alfonso II, ruled between 791 and 842, so very long reign, that further expansion, as we'll see, was achieved, raiding as far as Lisbon, right? In most areas, again, even today's northern, what would become, in fact, northern Portugal, almost half of a millennium later. Just, again, for telling you the size of time and space involved here, how gradual these mechanisms really were, and how they were just overlapping with prior ones. So looking at this expansion, because it's interesting, as we've seen, this was led by Alfonso the First of Asturias, who reigned from 739 to his death in 757. Right, he had inherited the throne thanks to his wife, Pelagius' daughter Ermesinda. The Albendensian Chronicle tells the story of how Alfonso arrived. Alfonso here, I will be switching likely, but the same guy, arrived in Asturias sometime after the Battle of Covadonga, exactly to marry Ermesinda. Then Fabula died, and he was accepted basically by the most powerful clans of Asturias as he was a Cantabrian, he was for Cantabria, establishing thus, at least in male line, the relative house of Cantabria that would rule on the land. At this point, as we were saying, there wasn't anything like a fixed capital, but even a fixed residence, right? There were just preferential places where the courts established themselves for a certain period of time. Most of how these lands were kept together was just by migrating from place to place, being maintained by the local nobility to get something, by giving something in exchange, and just consolidating the ties locally. Alfonso chose initially as his preferential residence the one of Cangas de Onís, and later, given as we'll see now, the gradual, if not the population, at least the gradual militarization of the plateau and the middle valley of the Ebro River, were the main strongholds of the Duchy of Cantabria, such as Amaya, Triceo, and the city of Cantabria were located. In any case, Asturias was a bit better, more compact, so that the descendants of the Cantabrian house, dating back to the aforementioned Dux Pedro, that were preferably staying around Rioja, would move towards, in fact, the Asturias, right, from Cantabria on the longer run. So, how did the expansion go? Well, Alfonso began from its first seat that was located essentially at the Picos de Europa, advancing to the west in Galicia. This was kind of a clever move because there were some ports there, and just consolidating longitudinally without harassing the Muslims, who still were strong in the south, was kind of against also more politically fragmented realities, like the better thing to do. Galicia, in general, was more permeable in this sense. The Douro Valley was still used for raids in the south, where surely towns and villages were captured, right? However, the latter area would also see a process of deportation, for which the local inhabitants were moved to safer areas in the north, so bringing also more manpower there, and turning this region rather than just a land of conquest, like a sort of fortified buffer area. So much so it was called the Desert of the Douro, used to protect the north from the Islamic attacks. As we will see, the degree by which the population was carried out is questioned historically. At least there seem to have two things to have happened. First of all, yes, we are in the 8th century, so a moment of actual economic revival of Europe, but in the north of Spain, still the major political dynamics correspond to the clash of this northern mountaineers against the still Arab, Visigothic, Roman system, right, of the estates and so on. So raids launched in the south for the sake of just creating this buffer area, fortifying it. We're not depopulated on, say, with the scientific purpose of getting people out of there, not making nobody inhabited it. First of all, there were, of course, still people living there. We see that easily from lots of sources, archaeological ones. We see literally from certain species, sort of animals, or of plants that were just nurtured there, and human settlement and so on, that this area of Central Plateau was still inhabited, right? The problem, though, is that when you have this northerners that come in free, the colonists, these tend to organize themselves in, first of all, they tend to get out, admittedly, of the frontier area that nobody really likes to live in, right, throughout all the Reconquista. Even the famous cattle, ship, in fact, industry, let's say, that developed in even later Middle Ages, etc., transhumance, etc., was a consequence of the depopulation of areas that had been, say, in Roman times, very, very well productive and and structure, right? Because the Christians and the Muslims just raided constantly and basically prohibited anything sanitary to establish itself, let's say, on a, to invest consistently in there for the development of greater things. That's why just shepherds were arrived there from the mountains during in winter, during the colder season. In the lowlands, where warfare was not usually carried out at that point. But here there is literally a social change. There is the idea that independently from the degree of actual, let's say, wealth, like there would be a political and social unhingement of especially the prior, again, estate system. So that many people decided to go live elsewhere because they could carve themselves, even out in the north, some sort of space where to survive, staying away from this era where they could finally flee from, as they had been under the Arabs at that point, and before under the Goths and so on. This is more or less what actually occurred, right? There were also epidemics. The same Arabs actually withdrew in part from the area. There were some revolts, for example, even of local garrisons, again against the Al-Andalus, especially the one of 740-41 was important. So nothing special. Like, this area could not be hyper-productive or hyper-developed or so on. So it simply, part of the population moved away for all these reasons or disappeared. But it remained still inhabited, and it just became more fragmented. More castles began to appear. It came to be more like a military frontier, and so this kind of outlook would form on the longer run. Alfonso I and Friula carried out also this raids pretty far away, if you look at it on the map, across the Duero Valley. And this had not been different, by the way, from the ones that the Asturias carried out in pre-Roman times against the south, the Celtiberians. So nothing new, really, and they could be even very... they could have also an interesting degree of strategic projection. Say most of the Reconquista video that we made illustrate this kind of warfare that sometimes is really impressive, because they could arrive from the north even to the south of Spain. However, this initial Asturian expansion was carried out mainly through Cantabrian territory from Galicia to Vizcaya. And it's not until the reigns of Ordoño I and Alfonso III that the Asturias gained effective, firm possession, control of the territories south of the Cantabrian Mountains. Right, so it was a very gradual process of further stabilization of the just most immediate territories, because that's at the end of the day how it happened. If you launched, as we'll see now, raids as far as Portugal, what would become so, you still do it by showing that your initiative is so great that you must make the enemy worry about more distant places, so leaving alone, right, the closest ones to you that can't just be gradually absorbed. So Friula I was Alfonso I's son, consolidated in this way his father's domains. He was, however, killed by members of the nobility that were siding with, the other members of the house of Cantabria. Then we have a bunch of other rulers whose period lasted altogether 23 years, from 768 to 791. We're talking about the monarchs Aurelius, Silo, Mauregatus, Bermuda I. We know very few about them, or at least, probably not much has been studied at the utmost depth. And as a consequence, this was seen, at least stereotypically, as a sort of moment of withdrawal, of the same Asturian power, right? A bit like the myth of the Merovingian Roi of Fainéant, attributed to the Asturian monarchs, and so on. Mostly in function, naturally, of the Reconquista, right? So the idea that they weren't harassing enough the Umayyads, and so on. Actually, the Asturias were changing significantly later. And this corresponded to some political unrest, right? It was an internal rebellion to establish rule during between 783 and 788 under the aforementioned Mauregatus, who removed Alphonse II from rule. Right, he would actually come back, as we noticed, in power like for quite a long time, almost 50 years, which actually is almost incredible considering these times and places. But surely the land was crossed by further agitations, other rebellions, especially carried out by the rising aristocrats, right, that mostly gathered, right, as sort of, say, pack of wolves, mostly, that had initially been following the Asturian monarchs, and that, however, given the increasing prestige of their position, the also the enrichment, right, they owned a larger amount of land than before, began to they tried at least to remove the Pelagius dynasty entirely from rule. This wouldn't actually succeed. There were rebellions such as the one of Nepotianus, Adroitus, Pinolus during the reign of Ramiro I, who ruled from 842 until his death in 850. The Asturian instability was exploited by the neighboring Basques and Galicians, who in fact launched raids in Asturian territory, and even managing in fact to occupy the eastern parts of it. This was naturally diminishing the prestige of Pelagius' dynasty, as these rulers were chosen primarily because of their military prowess. So if they were defeated, things were just sinking further. Sometimes, of course, these sides were also against one, and I'm talking about the aristocratic rebels and the foreigners against one another. That's why, for example, Alfonso II took refuge in the Basque lands in Alava after he was removed from power. The Asturians in part backed Nepotianus' rebellion. The Galicians sided with Ramiro I. So as you understand, it's not much just so cleanly cut right in a, say, political or national, you can say, sense. At this point, there is, say, a mixed picture here, because from one side you have a lot of freedmen that emerged in part from the settlement of refugees, or at least, again, those peoples in the areas settled by the Asturians in the Meseta, that conquered and fortified, that fled towards the north, and that began to have a say actually in the kingdom as such, together with also the local ones, freed slaves or something like that. Their rebellion, according to the aforementioned chronicles, occurred, for example, during the reign of Aurelius I. So there is surely a social undertow to this specifically. The idea was that, in part, that sense of estate collapsing brought some peasantry to start trying to shake off the chains from themselves and trying to compact themselves around more nuclear, families, and damaging like the sense of some extended clans that could rule bigger chunks of land. This we're talking about the end of the 8th, the beginning of the 9th century. However, the main trend in the longer run was surely the one of strengthening of the aristocratic power. Right, there is no doubt about this. This is true also for Castilla, that in the future will inherit basically the legacy of the Asturias as the single most monarchic and feudal power in the entire peninsula, and also the most military in nature. So there were some adjustments that mostly correspond to the fact that in these areas, with very few surplus, it was easier to shift still at this point kind of the balance, right? Mostly in an horizontal way. But on the longer run, it's on this new basis that still a further social stratification would occur. Fruela I, also known as the Cruel, by the way, and at least that's why in theory was assassinated in 768, was succeeded by Aurelius, that ruled until 774. Aurelius was the son of Fruela of Cantabria. So, in other words, the aforementioned Dux Peter of Cantabria as a grandson. He established the Asturian court, at least his favorite center, in San Martin del Rey Aurelio. In fact, it's known as Saint Martin of the King Aurelius, which previously belonged to Landgraves. Silus ruled as king of the Asturias from 774 to 83. He simply succeeded Aurelius after his death, and he moved his court to Pravia. Silus married Adosinda, who was one of the daughters of Alfonso I. So, again, the female line continues because this woman is Pelagia's granddaughter. Right, so you see always, at the end of the day, the same blood shared. It was ever more important for justifying this dynastic continuity. Alfonso II was elected by the Asturian nobility after Silus' death. Mauregatus, that we mentioned before, organized a rebellion. Alfonso took refuge among the Basques, that also, helped him to regain the throne. He was, by the way, son of a Basque princess, Munia. So, of course, as we've seen, they were substantially mixed dynastically. Alfonso II had interesting connections with the famous Saint Beatus of Lebanon, whose work has been copied extensively for our graphic joy, right? Of non-copyrighted pictures that I can use for the Spanish Middle Ages and Schwerpunkt. Saint Beatus was a monk, theologian, and geographer from Cantabria, and he stood out for mostly his fight against adoptionism. That was basically an Arian reminiscence, surely of Gothic, origin that in Spain had been remaining. So substantially, the concept that Jesus is not the Son of God, who at best adopted him, and so there is all a theological question now we cannot digress on, but was connected with also, in fact, heterodox views that reflect the difficulty of enforcing an orthodox in such a vast land, and still certain persistences that were typical in the nature, at least, of how Visigothic nobility had been developed, also in some more remote areas. In any case, Alfonso had important connections with this guy, and he received mostly a negative press historiographically, but he was surely an important ruler. There is some legend saying that Mauregatus was actually Alfonso I's bastard son with a Berber woman, but let's say, this defending, because he apparently had hundreds of maidens. But these are also, voices for, doesn't matter how possible such things definitely existed from a historical point of view. Alfonso was succeeded by, however, Bermudo I, who was Aurelius' brother. He was known as the Diacon, right, as he probably received minor vows. And he abdicated after he was defeated in battle, so that he ended his life in a monastery. But this is also interesting because, aside from his spiritual inclinations, very often, again, a military defeat could bring to a substantial political failure. We can speak of properly the kingdom of Asturias only for Alfonso II's reign between 791 and 842, because it was a consistently long reign, and the territorial situation was stabilized. Right, we passed from this tribal phase to a sort of at least aristocratic one, if not already dynastically oriented one. There is a substantial expansion. Silus subjugated Galicia, and also managed to strike back into the west of the Basque country, getting part of it under his control. These are the years of the Carolingian Empire, right, that at its peak had intervened in northeastern Spain mostly, but that was interestingly connect with this other more central western powers of the north. Alfonso II sent Charlemagne the spoils of war that the Asturians had looted from the Muslims during the raid of Lisbon in 797. And on this occasion, Alfonso's envoys introduced the sovereign as, quote, an Emperor Charlemagne's man, right? So that speaks, if not of suzerainty, at least some kind of clientary connection. The idea that, the fame, power of the ruler could be boosted locally by support by the Carolingians, that mostly also needed the flanks covered because of their campaigns in northern Iberia, and so mostly the Asturians could harass the Basques that, as we were saying before, also took out the Frankish rearguard at the Battle of Roncesvalles, and also risked to crush, at least on another occasion, a consistent Carolingian force, right, together with the Arab support, by the way. There are naturally some legends about this ruler as well, concerning the ritual, for example, of the Asturian court, mutuating it from certain Visigothic ones used in the previous kingdom, right? But this is possible in as much as institutionally the monarchy was consolidating further, and of course an important part of Visigothic models were simply collected, right, especially from a Christian background there. Don't underestimate the Arab influences for that matter, but at least to the least degree in the Iberian Peninsula comparatively. Very importantly, from the land, for the land, it's at this point, around this time, at least we do not precisely, that the bones of James, right, the son of Zebedee, right, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, were at least declared to have been found in Galicia at Iria Flavia, an ancient settlement, former bishopric, which were considered authentic by the Roman Pope of the time, probably also to establish further connections with these lands and so on. But there was surely some continuity. We can see a few of that, but it's at least in terms of relics of certain other spiritual legacies that were at this point maybe sublimated for ideological purposes, and also making up some of it. But still, right, these are the famous relics of Santiago, the one of Compostela, from which, in fact, it would be at some point looted, ravaged by the Muslims at the time of Al-Manzur, however respecting the relics of St. James, right? Because at that point the Muslims wanted to gain consensus among these populations. Also, the relics of Saint Eulalia of Merida, a young Roman Christian martyr that had been martyred, in fact, in the Merida, Augusta Emerita, that was the Latin name, and at this point located in Oviedo, that would rise as the most important center of the Asturias, became, however, the most important religious site for the moment in the region, right? Focus of devotion and so on. Naturally, there were others of this kind, but these are some of the most famous that would last historically, not to be lost in the midst of history. Alfonso II is believed to have partly repopulated, or at least developed further, some parts of Galicia, Leon, and also Castile, that were de facto at this point incorporated into the kingdom, essentially paving the way again for what would become the future kingdom, also of Castile and Leon. As I understand, given the footprint, the western Basque lands were also further, influenced and in part controlled by the Asturians. The most important center, seat of the court, was still Cangas de Onís, right? That had been established there because also it was, among the other advantages, was close to the site of the Battle of Cavadonga. Then, at the time of Silas, at the end of the 8th century, the main center was moved to Pravia. It would be Alfonso II to choose Oviedo, however, as the center of the kingdom around 789, because it was his birthplace, right? So this characteristic center owes to the sovereign his fortune mostly. Ramiro I consolidated power internally as well. He basically took out several opponents to his rule in the country, as it was the common practice of the time. They were accused of treason. They wanted to, they literally claimed the throne for themselves. So they were captured, blinded, and confined in the monasteries, which was the most common practice. I mean, look at what the Carolingians themselves were normally doing at this point, as basically everybody else. Physical fitness is a prerequisite for being a ruler, so carving somebody's eyes out is a good mean, I would say. Some would die just out of the, the operation, the infection, whatever, but most, you take them out, you imprison them in monasteries, and there they really go. Ramiro was a warrior ruler, as all these ones, but he was surely talented in that he managed to crush, we'll see it now, a Norse expedition after the Vikings had landed probably at Coruña. He also fought, as it was by that point already habitual, right, seasonal, cyclical against the Moors in the south. He was succeeded by his son Ordoño I ruled from 850 until his death in 866. He put down a major rebellion of the Basques in the east of what had become, in fact, the kingdom of the Asturias, even in these Basque lands. In 851, Ordoño besieged Albelda. There was a fortress previously built by Musa al-Khazari, right, the leader of the Muwallad Bani Qazi clan that ruled basically a semi-autonomous principality in the upper Ebro Valley in northern Iberia in the 9th century. This was a very powerful guy. He seemingly had very mixed background, including a Visigothic one. And he, again, was one of the most one of the boldest Arab leaders, given his decentralized position, his extensive power, this mechanism, this game, with the Carolingians, with the Catalan marches, also the Northerners. We've seen Pamplona. I made several videos about the beginnings in those areas of the Christian principalities of the Reconquista, but mostly they were also allied at some point with the Arabs in their for their internal feuds and so on. The reason why Ordoño came in contrast with Musa ibn Musa is that, again, having expanded further his power east into the Basque lands, the locals had asked for support by, you go further east, so you meet at some point Zaragoza, right? The Musa ibn Musa ruled over most of this, was the most important center in his hands, together with Tudela, Huesca, and the same Toledo. So it was an enormously powerful ruler, just challenging the Cordoban one in Andalusia. Musa attempted with an army to lift the siege, together with his brother-in-law Garcia Iniguez, that was the ruler of Pamplona, and just to tell you how the Christians and the Arabs were really intertwined. Given that Pamplona, by the way, stood in the way of potential Asturian expansion eastwards, so there was a major clash, as it mostly follows out of like the attempt of breaking a siege during the Middle Ages, in which the Asturians crush the Islamic and Navarrese army. Musa lost a great amount of men, of riches, because these guys traveled all the day with their treasures in the tents. They had to gather followers, mercenaries, and so on. And most of this this wealth was, I said most, at least some of the most precious trophies, let's say, were sent by the Asturians as a gift to Charles the Bald in Francia. So showing how at this point, even though the Carolingian Empire was falling apart, and Charles was Charles II after Charlemagne, emperor, but de facto ruling just in Western Frankish kingdom, how close the Asturians were, at least with the Western Frankish rulers, just out of again this possible intervention, relieving pressure from the Spanish mark that still responded to the Carolingians, by essentially fighting against the same people who were pressuring it, right, from the west of Catalonia, let's say, and from the east, let's say, of the Asturians. So this warlike enterprises naturally conferred ever more prestige and political compaction to this realm. The victory at Albelda is a huge deal. First of all, this place is razed to the ground, and most of those who defended it were slaughtered by the Asturians, because they couldn't hold this fortress, and it was a pain in the behind, like in the hands of the enemy. So it was a major blow, because also just as an avant-post, like as a major actually center, considering the regional standards, really, it was a great loss for the for the Arabs. Musa himself was wounded apparently in the battle, so at least the chronicles say, and he would die in 862-3. This opened to a crisis in his dominions, as most of these were also just like a cluster of different rulers brought temporarily under control. And Musa's son Lub, that ruled from Toledo, properly the heart, the key of the Meseta, of the Iberian plateau, submitted himself to the Asturian king for the rest of Ordoño's reign. It was personal, it was temporary, but this is basically the first time that the northern, say, powers, the Christians, managed to extend their dominion, albeit indirectly still, on Toledo as really the, maybe not the Schwerpunkt as such of Spain, but essentially the symbolic and also properly pumping heart, right, of a bit this broader Iberian culture during the Middle Ages, right? Cordoba, the south, were more important, but Toledo, once acquired, could really open the way to the south as well. This occurred naturally throughout different expeditions, ravages, pressure, and so on. So it was based on tribute. So you understand the degree by which the Asturians rose in power throughout this few centuries, right? This naturally speaks also of the general discontent, or at least, let's say, the malice that would derive from, not much just from the Islamic domination per se, right? Different religious group that basically imposes itself on these others, doesn't matter how tolerantly to a degree, like not the concept of contemporary tolerance, but still creating some problems, some divisions, still some sense that this is not the right direction the system should take, especially because the major center of power is in the south, which is also by a degree another country, right? So the Asturians helped unhinging this system. At this point, however, the history of the kingdom as such ends. Right, Alfonso the Third was forced to abdicate by his sons in 910, and this brought to the partition of the kingdom. That's how it really ended. The three chunks are Leon, Galicia, and Asturias themselves. This group would be reunited in 924, Leon and Galicia in 914, the Asturias later. However, it was established as the crown of Leon. Right, you see that power shifts naturally towards the south because those were the more advanced areas, right? So these rulers, the first thing they do is that they move, like we've seen it for Cantabria with the Asturias, and then now further south because it's just a better place to rule from, politically, institutionally, socially, strategically, economically, and as I always say, civilization is not a matter of personal opinion. In a way that you can argue that the kingdom as such, because there was now a sense of legacy of this monarchy didn't simply disappear out of the blue, but that it was subsumed by the kingdom of Castile. Much later, though, in the 13th century, because Ferdinand the Third, that was the king of Castile in the early 13th century, became joint king of the two kingdoms. So you have that sum, right, and a resuming, of course, also of these territories historically, conferring more prestige. A brief parenthesis can be drawn for the Viking raids on the kingdom of Asturias. These are the centuries, again, the 9th to the 10th century, in which the Norse begin to show up pretty much everywhere in Europe, along the European coastline. There was a first invasion in 844 that, as we remembered, was crushed by Ramiro at Coruña. Seemingly, a large part of the Norse was cut down by some sort of ballistas, so Tertian engines, catapults that shot this massive javelins, arrows, and this may be an indicator just of maybe some kind of technical development of Iberia, maybe with a Roman legacy, or even an Arab influence. Like, I made lots of videos about medieval Iberian warfare, and by a degree we have underestimated how developed Spain was, like until it was fully Frankish, right? And so we cannot distinguish properly a local say structure on its own later on in the High Middle Ages. But here, especially in the north of Spain, you wouldn't imagine an enormous technical development. I mean, the same Norse managed to besiege Paris with similar catapults, so it's not really about certain how developed or non-developed you are. These are weapons, however, that are used in the context of perhaps some kind of siege operation, or at least the Vikings would land maybe to storm a fortress, and these had catapults, so it's possible in that regard. We know, however, that on this occasion 70 Viking longships were captured on why they were landed, so likely they had already just moored there, beached there, and were attacked by the Asturians later. So this was perhaps some form of portable catapult, right? The Norse ships were burned, right? Maybe 70 is an exaggeration, but we don't know, because they were large forces, as we will see also later. We know that the Viking force just a few months later took Seville, right? Muslim Seville. That was then part of the Emirate of Cordoba, with basically the second most important city. So it's interesting to look at this contrast, right, of the most kind of primitive warlike north manages to defend successfully, and a bit the softer but richer and still practically untouched south that is at least suffers this raid. The Vikings rose the Guadalquivir on that occasion. I mean, the typical strategy and tactics of the Viking era that you find in France, you find in other places. So there was another Viking raid in Galicia in 951 at the time of Ordoño I. That was temporarily, by the way, busy crushing his enemies, at that point mostly the Arabs. However, another ruler, the Count of Galicia, Don Pedro, as recorded by sources, attacked the Norse in his stead and inflicted severe losses upon them. Alfonso III was concerned because of these coastal attacks that weren't carried out, by the way, just by the Vikings. The Moors too had seaborne capabilities, of course, in the north, and they would be launching this amphibious raids as well, which is also fascinating. Perhaps we will look at that a bit more in depth. In any case, in 968 we have Gundered, a Viking warlord from Norway, attacking Galicia with 100 ships and 8,000 warriors. These guys were a very large force, as you understand, and they couldn't quite be stopped that easily, so they roamed around for a substantial bit. They even occupied Santiago de Compostela. However, a Galician count, allegedly of Visigothic descent, Gonzalo Sanchez, managed to crush them after 3 years of plunder in an open battle, in which Gunrod was captured and executed on the field together with his followers. And this tells you what are the general risks of, not just being an Asturian, but also being a Viking during the 10th century. And we're talking about fiercely, again, brutal, bloody, merciless realities, right? You're a guy who steps into my land, raiding, plundering, whatever. You're picked. You're not even a Christian. They'll just massacre you, right? This is interesting that the Christians, the Arab, the Muslims, the Jews considered themselves, in spite of the enmities, as part more or less of the same club, right, of the Brahminic, at least what we call improperly monotheistic, which doesn't really mean anything, at least it's a redundant term, it's just the polytheistic, the one that never existed really. But the pagan, at least what they, from this non-Abrahamic perspective, consider as a pagan, was considered just like much more easily massacrable, right? Like with much less sort of moral issues, right? Even than a Muslim in a sense. Mostly, admittedly, in this case, because the Muslims were just next door enemies, but in this sense neighbors as well. So they weren't, as we've seen, just fighting with the Christians, and was already at this point a considerable mutual interaction, let's say. But the sense that the heathen was some sort of broader danger for civilization was, together with the latter crashing him, and just proving where the upper hand it really is a pretty clear notion, even at this point in northern Spain. So you see, we gradually go towards the Leon, the Castilian power, basically, and we will see these things in another video. We are covering very gradually the Reconquista, and I'm glad whenever we can stop on it. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.